Okay. Hello everyone and welcome to this training course which I'm running on the weeds, bits and beards, or should I say the hawkweeds, the hawkbits and the hawk's beards. These dandelion lookalikes that you should be seeing quite a lot of at this time of year. And if you don't know me, my name is Josh Stiles. I am a botanist, and although I may look young, hopefully I still do, I have got over 15 years botanical recording and horticultural experience behind me. So I like to think I know a little bit about what I'm talking about. And so without any further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so the weeds, bits and beards. They all belong to a marvellous family of plants, Asteraceae. It's the largest family of plants on Earth, largest family of vascular plants on Earth, and it contains some really beautiful plant species that are unlikely to be mistaken for anything else, at least here in Britain anyway. Things like carline thistle in this bottom left-hand corner, or melancholy thistle in the bottom right corner. Lovely plants like mountain everlasting in this top left corner. It's an exceptionally diverse group, and it is again the largest plant family on Earth. It's a very group, as I've just said, and there are over 100 different species in this family represented in Britain. Some of them are very distinctive, again like the carline thistle or the mountain everlasting. However, some are a little bit more problematic and superficially similar, which is why I'm running this course on the weeds, bits and beards, these dandelion lookalikes. Okay. And although Asteraceae is the largest vascular plant family on the planet, they didn't diverge very long ago. In fact, they're thought to have diverged about 85 million years ago, which is during the late Cretaceous, which is when some lovely paleobotanists found some fossilized pollen attributed to a member of the Asteraceae. It was a bit later on that we started to discover the first fossilized plant remains that weren't pollen of this family. One of the earliest fossils of this family is this beautiful thistle-like plant down here, Regenreincura, which is from the mid-Eocene, about 47 million years ago. So it might sound like a long time, but in evolutionary terms, it's not very long at all. They diverged relatively recently. And because they are so diverse and abundant, and there are so many species here in Britain and elsewhere across the world, they are important. They form important constituents of many of our habitats that we get here in Britain. And just to demonstrate that importance, I'm taking a look on something called the Biological Record Centre database of insects and their food plants. And if we look in this table here, we can see that dandelions in the Taraxacum officinale aggregate. Dandelions are a host plant for over 100 different species of insect, which is incredible. If we take a look at creeping thistle, a really common plant in the family Asteraceae, over 80 species use creeping thistle as a food plant. And of course, this table just considers use of these plants by insects as the food plant. It doesn't consider use of these plants by fungi and other organisms that aren't insects, or pollinators. Of course, many of these plants are really super important for a huge number of pollinating invertebrates. And just one example of an insect that uses members of the a member of the Asteraceae as a food plant is this lovely hawkbit gallfly, Tephrotis vespertina by Stephen Falk. And this species lays its eggs on hawkbit flower heads. The larvae then consume bits and bobs inside the flower head, including the seeds, and then it later emerges as a fly. It's a beautiful thing, I think. So yeah, really important constituents of many of our different habitats here in Britain. Okay. And as I said, many plants in this family are so easily identified because they're so distinctive and unmistakable. However, more troublesome to identify includes the hawkweeds, bits, beards, and similar species, relatives, which are all these dandelion lookalikes that should be in flower about this time of year. Okay, and it's those we want to focus upon, of course. Okay, so the weeds, bits, and beards. Sounds like three groups, but one thing I do want to mention early on is that these three groups are in fact split up into 5 different genera. And that includes Crepis for hawk's beards, Hieracium and Pilocella for the hawkweeds, and for the hawkbits, it includes Leontodon and Scorzonoroides. And I wanted to mention that at this early stage. Don't worry too much if you don't have time to write that down. We will be delving into these genera, these groups, into a lot more depth later on today. Okay, marvelous. So your hawkweeds, beards, and some similar species. These are all commonly, they contain species that are commonly occurring plants, found across a huge variety of different habitats, including roadside verges, your own lawn, and on rough ground as well. However, although some species of hawkweed, bit, and beard are very common around this time of year especially, some species in these groups are specially adapted to very particular habitats and can sometimes be used as indicator species as to the quality of habitat that you're actually looking at. One such species may include something like this plant pictured down here, smooth catsia, which is a beautiful plant. At least I think it's beautiful. It's a beautiful plant that you'll find across acid grasslands, Breckland, heaths, and it's also nationally scarce. So less than 100 places in the country where you can find this beautiful, diminutive little plant. Marvellous. Okay. So just moving away from the history and the introduction, I've set 3 learning objectives for today's course, and those include these. So to confidently discern between your weeds, bits, beards, and some similar species, these dandelion lookalikes. That is what I want you to be able to do by the end of this course. Be able to tell those things apart in the field. Okay. The second learning objective is to be able to use a dichotomous key, which again I'll be looking at a bit later on. We'll all be looking at a bit later on. And the third learning objective is I want you to complete a bit of homework with these, which will hopefully solidify all of this theory in your own mind anyway. Super. So 3 learning objectives from today's course that I want to be applicable to you guys. Marvellous. Okay. So I've said I want you to confidently discern between your hawkweeds, bits, and beards, plus similar species. And so just to narrow that down a little bit more, what we will be looking at today are your weeds, bits, and beards, but we'll also be looking at catsias, and doing a little bit on sow thistles and ox tongues. All of these things are dandelion lookalikes. But of course, weeds, bits, beards, and catsias et al. Doesn't have the same ring to it. So hence the name of the course. Okay, so if we take a look at the number of species for each of these groups present in Britain, which is the middle column, we've got 10 species of hawk's beard in that genus Crepis. We've got over 420 hawkweeds, which may seem very daunting at first, but I will be going into that in the next slide, so don't worry. We've got 3 hawkbits, 3 cat's ears, 4 sow thistles, and 2 ox tongues. Those are the numbers of species for each group present in Britain. However, many of those plants are very rare and or very hard to ID, which might include these hawkweeds. And so what I've done in the column on the right is include the number of species for each group that is common and widespread. And so hopefully, if you look at this column on the right, we've got 2 hawksbeards that are common and widespread. You've got 1 hawkweed, you've got 3 hawkbits. Hopefully these numbers will make you feel significantly less daunted when it comes to the identification of these species groups. Okay, so I've said there are over 420 hawkweeds in Britain. Why is that? Well, it's all about a process known as apomixis, where essentially the parent plant doesn't require fertilization. The ovules that develop into the seeds are exact copies of the parent plant. The progeny are the exact copies of the parent plant. And it's thought that we have so many species because in the distant past there were fertile or partially fertile hawkweeds in the genus Asteraceae that hybridized, and the offspring were not fertile or partially fertile, they were fully apomictic. And so those hybridization events fixed these apomictic lineages. Now I will be giving information for a resource that talks a little bit more about apomixis if you're keen to find out more. But when it comes to the hawkweeds in the genus Asteraceae, because there are so many in Britain, my general advice is if you know you've got a hawkweed in the genus Asteraceae, leave it at that. Just record this one group to genus level because they are very, very difficult to identify to species level. Okay, marvellous. So let's get on to the identification. Let's uncover the identity of these mystery dandelion lookalikes. Marvellous. Okay. And so before we investigate the weeds, bits, beards, and similar species, these groups individually, what I first want to look at are the morphological characters, the characters that you need to be aware of that will help you to identify these dandelion lookalikes to species level. And so first up, it's important to know about the species, the plant's growth form. In many species of dandelion lookalike, you'll find that they only produce a singular basal rosette, just like this common cat's ear on the left here. However, by comparison, you've also got your mouse ear hawkweed in the genus Pilocella. And species in the genus Pilocella produce stolons, something called a stolon. Stolons are leafy runners that root at the nodes, and these stolons allow the plant to form patches. Okay, and so if you're looking at a plant with runners, with stolons, it is stoloniferous. You have a mouse ear hawkweed. If you're not, and it just has a basal rosette, and then you're likely not going to be looking at a mouse ear hawkweed. Okay, so growth form is an important character to pay attention to when you're looking at one of these dandelion lookalikes. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is something called the capitulum. When people see a flower head of a daisy or a thistle or a dandelion, etc., or another plant in the family Asteraceae, they'll often describe the flower head as a single flower, but that is actually not the case. If you didn't know already, a single flowering head of one of these dandelion lookalikes, just here, if you open it up, you'll actually find that the single flowering head, or properly called the capitulum, actually comprises many flowers or florets packed together. And so as opposed to referring to a flowering head of hawkbit or hawkweed as a flower, it should be properly termed as a capitulum. And if we take a look deeper into the capitulum, you'll find two different kinds of flowers. And it's important to know about the different kinds of flowers in florets in a capitulum. And those include these. So we've got disc florets, which are usually concentrated to the very centre of the flowering head, the capitulum, which are tubular-like structures, which you can see on the right here. That's a disc floret. What we've also got, usually concentrated around the edges of the capitulum, are these ligulate florets that produce these petal-like structures known as ligules. And ligules we'll be talking about in a little bit more depth momentarily. Okay, so it's not a flower, it's a capitulum made of many different flowers. And we've also got disc florets and ligulate florets. Okay, what we also may find in the capitulum of one of these dandelion lookalikes is something called receptacle scales. So if you open up a flower head of a cat's ear in the genus Hawkweeds, you will find these bits of tissue, little bracts that aren't ligulate florets, they aren't disc florets. They are known as receptacle scales, and that is a very distinctive character for cat's ear in the genus Hawkweeds. So none of the other weeds, bits or beards have these receptacle scales. It's a very distinctive character. And so that's another thing to be aware of when it comes to the capitulum. I just want to talk about one more thing when it comes to the capitulum, the flowering head. No, I don't. I want to talk about two more things. Okay. So I mentioned there are two different flowers inside a capitulum. Those disc florets and the ligulate florets that produce petal-like structures known as ligules. And it's important to know what a ligule is, because sometimes you'll get on the underside of a ligule a flash of colour, like in this lesser hawkbit here. And that flash of colour is known as a ligule stripe. It's a stripe of colour on the underside of a ligule, on the outer edge of the flowering head. And it's important to know about ligule stripes as well, because sometimes it is an important identification character. And the colour of a ligule stripe can be very different depending on the species you're looking at. For example, in lesser hawkbit, pictured here, you've got a greyish ligule stripe. That can be different in different species. In this hawkweed, it's completely yellow. If we look at mouse ear hawkweed, it's a hot pink colour. If we look at rough hawkbit, it can be a crimson red colour. And so ligule stripes and the colour of those ligule stripes is it can be a really important identification character. Okay, one more thing when it comes to the capitulum that is important to be aware of. They are the involucral bracts. Involucral bracts are essentially green scaly bits that hug the capitulum, the flowering head. And they can also be an important identification character. Hopefully you can see these scaly bits here. These are individually known as the involucral bracts. And involucral bracts can also be an important identification feature. In hawk's beards, in the genus Crepis, you get two very distinctive rows of involucral bracts. If we look on this picture to the left, what we've got are these two rows of involucral bracts. You've got the outer row, which is quite small, and then the inner row is much larger than the outer row. And that is important to know about, because if you've got a yellow dandelion lookalike and it's got two rows of involucral bracts, then that is an important identification character, because it will tell you you're looking at a hawkweed, hawk's beard in the genus Crepis. Okay. Okay, moving away from the flowering structures, or rather the capitulum, I want to talk next about the seeds, or as they're properly termed, the achenes. Sometimes you'll get species that have a stalk or a beak, otherwise known as a beak, connecting the achene to the pappus. And so you might have a pappus that has a stalk attaching it to the achene, or like in this picture to the left, you've got a seed and achene on the right that is actually directly attached to the pappus. The pappus just being this inside-out umbrella-like structure, which aids with wind dispersal. And so, yes, you may have seeds that are directly attached to the pappus, or you may have the achene, the seed, that is attached to the pappus by way of a stalk or a beak. Okay, marvellous. Next slide. Okay, so moving away from the capitulum and from the seeds, your flowering stems can also be a really important character in differentiating one species from the next. In common catsia, that is a species that has a branched stem, so it has more than one capitulum per individual flowering stem. In many other species, in particular the hawkbits in the genus Leontodon, like this lesser hawkbit, you've got a flowering head, a capitulum. You only have a flowering stem that has one capitulum attached to it, so it's unbranched. Okay, so whether a flowering stem is branched or not, that can tell you, it can certainly give you a hint as to what you're actually looking at. Okay, another important ID feature. Okay, and one last thing I wanted to look at in terms of the morphological characters are the bits on the leaves. Now, many species of hawkweed, bit, beard, and close relatives, they have leaves that are quite variable in shape. And so what I would say is that leaf shape is not a reliable character when it comes to identification in many cases. However, sometimes on the leaf you'll get a plant with Y-shaped hairs, forked hairs, just like these on this wonderful picture by Kevin Widowson. And so if you've got a plant with these forked hairs, you have a Leontodon, a hawkbit in the genus Leontodon. And so, yes, you do need to get really up close and personal to a leaf to see whether those hairs are Y-shaped or not. So it'd be good to have a magnifying glass or a hand lens or even a microscope to hand if you have any of those. Hand lenses are really, really cheap and a really, really important tool for plant identification in the field. So if you haven't got one already, definitely invest in one. Okay. So yes, Y-shaped hairs on the leaves, you've got a hawkbit Leontodon species. Okay, so now we've gone over some of the important morphological characters. Before we dive into the groups themselves, let's take a look at this rudimentary key that I've put together, just to refresh ourselves a little bit on the characters that I've just gone over. Okay, feel free to screenshot this and use it in any way if you like. By the way, okay, so first and foremost, we need to ask ourselves, is the plant that is right in front of us, has it got more than one capitulum per flowering stem? If the answer to that is no, we need to ask another question. We need to ask, does the plant have stolons? Is it stoloniferous? Remember those trailing runners that allow the plant to produce patches? If it produces stolons, then you've got a mouse-ear hawkweed in the genus Pilocella. If it doesn't produce stolons, then you've got a hawkbit in the genus Leontodon. Okay. But then what if I have a plant in front of me that has a branched flowering stem with more than one capitulum per flowering stem? Well, we then need to ask ourselves about those receptacle scales. Remember the bits of tissue inside the capitulum that are not disc florets or ray florets. These bits of tissue in the capitulum. If the capitulum does have receptacle scales, these bits of tissue, then we've got a catsia in the genus Hypocheris. The answer to that is no, we don't have receptacle scales. We can then move on to ask ourselves about the involucral bracts. Are the involucral bracts in two rows, with the lower being shorter than the inner? If the answer to that is yes, then we've got a hawk's beard. That's a really, really good character to tell whether you've got a hawk's beard or not in the genus Crepis. If we have, if the involucral bracts aren't like that, then we've got one last question, and that is, are the flowering stems leafless? If the flowering stems are branched and they don't have any leaves, then we've got autumn hawkbit in the genus Scorzonavoises. If we've got a flowering stem that leads up to the flowers, with leaves on it, then we've got a hawkweed in the genus Hyraceum. Now, I did say early on that I did want to cover the ox tongues and the sow thistles. However, this course is focusing primarily on the dandelion lookalikes, and the sow thistles and ox tongues are really tall, weedy plants that are quite distinctive. And so I've not included them in this key, but I will be going on to them towards the end of this presentation. Marvelous. Okay, but let's start off with the weeds, the hawkweeds. As I said early on again, the hawkweeds are split up into two distinctive genera, and they include the Hyraceum. Remember those apomictic hawkweeds, over 420 known in Britain, and a hawkweed is pictured on the right here in the genus Hyraceum. But we've also got the mouse-ear hawkweeds in the genus Pilosella. Mouse-ear hawkweeds pictured on the left. So let's first have a look at the characters of Hyraceum, the hawkweeds. How do we know we've got a plant in the genus Hyraceum? Well, there are a few different characters, although what I will first reiterate is it's a very difficult group to identify to species level. So if you know you've got a hawkweed in this genus, record it to genus level only, and don't go any further because you will stress yourself out. I have had a hell of a lot of stress trying to identify these things. So yeah, if you're just starting out, especially with plant ID and getting into these species, try and record hawkweeds to genus level only. Okay, so characters of the Hyraceum, well, they typically have over one capitulum per flowering stem. I don't think I've ever seen a hawkweed in the genus Hyraceum that has just one capitulum per flowering stem, although I'm sure it might happen. But yes, typically there's more than one capitulum per flowering stem. If we look at this picture, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 flowering heads on this singular flowering stem. The achenes, the seeds, are directly attached to the pappus, and so there's no stalk from the pappus to the achene, which hopefully you might be able to see in this top right picture here. All hawkweeds have unstalked achenes. Okay. Another character with the Hyraceum, the hawkweeds, is there is usually a basal rosette present and stem leaves on the flowering stem. So hopefully in this picture you can see there's 1, 2 stem leaves there. Okay, and that's another distinctive character which you get with the Hyraceum. Okay. And unlike the mouse-ear hawkweeds that we touched upon earlier when we were talking about growth form, the hawkweeds in this genus do not produce stolons, those runners that allow the plant to form patches. Okay. By contrast, the mousy hawkweeds do. They are stoloniferous, and hopefully you can see that this is a stolon on the right here, and you'll see the little stolons trailing away from this basal rosette in the picture on the left. So it's a patch forming group of plants, are the mousy hawkweeds in the genus Pilosella. And there is one common yellow flowering species in this genus, and that is just common old mousy hawkweed, Pilosella officinarum, which is pictured here. And the characters of this plant is that there is one capitulum per flowering stem. The achenes, just like the Hieraceum, the other hawkweeds, they are unstalked. There is no stalk from the pappus to the achene. Okay. And another character that I love about this, the mousy hawkweed, is that on the underside of the leaves and the stolons, it is usually a really brilliant snow white, which you can see on this picture here. And the plant itself is quite densely hairy as well. So it's this fluffy, delicate white colour on the underside of the leaves and the stolons, which is a wonderful character because none of the other hawkweeds, bits and beards have that, or relatives. And yes, as I say, mousy hawkweeds, they are stoloniferous. One thing I do want you to be aware of, though, as I say, this course is looking at the troublesome hawkweeds, bits and beards that look all alike. They look like dandelions. One thing to be aware of is this, which is fox and cubs. It's also in the genus Pilosella. However, it's not exactly a dandelion look-alike. It produces orange flowers. And so that is why I don't particularly want to cover this species in too much depth. It is very widespread. It's a widespread non-native plant. But yes, that's one thing to be aware of. Multiple flowers per flowering stem, but unlike the remainder of the plants and groups we're going to be talking about today, it's not exactly a dandelion look-alike. It produces these brilliant orange flowers. Okay, so those are the hawkweeds covered. And hopefully you've taken all that in. Let's move next onto the hawkweeds. I said earlier on, there are two genera for the hawkbits, just like there are for the hawkweeds. We've got Scorzonoroides, which includes one species, autumn hawkbit, and we've got Leontodon, which includes two species, which are the remainder of the hawkbits. And these genera are very different from each other. There are a number of characters that separate them quite easily, really, and they include these. Okay, so Scorzonoroides has more than one capitulum per flowering stem. By comparison, species in the genus Leontodon have one capitulum per flowering stem. Also, the hairs across the leaves and other bits of the plant on Scorzonoroides, autumn hawkbit, they are not forked. They're not Y-shaped. If we go back to those Y-shaped hairs when you get close and personal with the leaf and other bits of the plant. But yes, autumn hawkbit doesn't have those forked hairs, whereas Leontodon do. And they are the only, Leontodon is the only genus we're going to be looking at today that has those Y-shaped hairs. It's a really distinctive character. Both Leontodon and Scorzonoroides have unstalked achenes, or unstalked pappuses, where there is no stalk connecting the achene and the pappus. Okay. Okay, so I've said there are two Leontodon species. Let's take a look at those. And how to differentiate them is, though these plants might look superficially similar, there are a couple of characters that easily differentiate these two bad boys. If we take a look on the left at rough hawkbit, Leontodon hispidus, as its name might suggest, it's covered in rough hairs. Which you can hopefully see from these two pictures on the left here. In particular, the flowering stems of rough hawkbit are really conspicuously hairy. By contrast, lesser hawkbit has glabrous, without hair, to sparsely hairy stems. So there might be the odd hair here and there. If we take a look on this bottom right image, you'll see the flowering stem doesn't have any hair on it at all. Also, another character is rough hawkbit often has these reddish ligule stripes. Remember the stripe of colour on the underside of the ligule. By comparison, lesser hawkbit has a lovely greyish ligule stripe. Okay, and so there's some nice characters that will enable you to separate these two species of hawkbit. So those are the hawkbits covered. Now, don't worry if you're not taking absolutely everything in from this course, because what I've done at the end of this presentation is I've created a little website that leads to a key that I've created, which is illustrated with some beautiful pictures that will hopefully enable you to discern between your bits, beards, weeds and similar species. So again, don't worry if you're not taking absolutely every single thing in from this course, because I've got a lovely little resource for you that will help you identify these plants and set into stone all of this theory. Marvellous. Okay, so let's move on to beards now, the hawk's beards. As I said earlier on, those involucral bracts are a really important diagnostic character for this species group in the genus Crepis, just the one genus for the hawk's beards. So the involucral bracts, the scaly green bits of tissue that hug the flowering head, they're in two rows, with the lowest row being much smaller than the upper inner row, which you can hopefully see from this bottom right picture. Okay, and that is a really important character that is diagnostic for Crepis species. I said there are two common and widespread species of hawk's beard, and I'll take a look at those now. Okay, so we've got smooth hawk's beard, Crepis capillaris, and beaked hawk's beard, Crepis vesicaria, which are both very different from each other and both very common and widespread, particularly in England. Okay, so with smooth hawk's beard, as its name might suggest, it's usually very smooth, glabrous, without hair. It can be sparsely hairy as well. By comparison, you've got your beaked hawk's beard, which is usually very, very hairy, although there is some variability with that, and it could be a little bit sparsely hairy sometimes too. Also, with your smooth hawk's beard, you have always got achenes that have not got that stalk between the pappus and the achene. Okay, so the pappus and the achene, they're unstalked basically. With beaked hawk's beard, you've got the stalk or beak connecting the achene to the pappus. And so hopefully using those characters, you'll be able to easily differentiate these two species in the field. Another thing about both of these species, beaked hawk's beard is a perennial, non-native plant, whereas smooth hawk's beard is an annual to biannual native plant, so it only lives a year or two. Okay, those are the hawk's weeds, bits and beards covered. Let's now look at the cat ears in the genus Hypocaris. So there are 3 species of cat's ear recorded for Britain. However, spotted cat's ear and one that I talked about a little bit earlier on, smooth cat's ear, both of those species are very uncommon through most of Great Britain, and they are present in some really special habitats. And so the cat's ear you're really only likely to see is common cat's ear, Hypocaris radicata. Okay, so how do you know if you've got a cat's ear? Well, you have those receptacle scales present in the capitulum. Remember those random bits of tissue that are not disc florets and they are not ligulate florets. So I've whacked this nice little diagram and a couple of pictures in here on the bottom. Lovely diagram from Mick Crawley, which illustrates the receptacle scale. Okay, that's a really, really important ID feature sometimes. As well, the flowering stems, they are branched, so there's more than one capitulum per flowering stem. The pappus is stalked. There is a stalk connecting the achene to the pappus. And as well, a really nice character that I didn't mention earlier on is this group of plants are called the cat's ears, and they get their names from these little scaly bits, these bracts that go up the flowering stem, and they resemble, or at least they're supposed to resemble, cat's ears. And so that is a really nice identification feature too for your cat's ears. Okay, so those are the weeds, bits, beards, and cat's ears covered. So hopefully, if you guys take a quick look at this key again, hopefully these little grey boxes asking the questions will make a bit more sense to you. Again, feel free to screenshot this and use it however you like. But I have got a better key available on a web link that I will be talking about at the end of this presentation momentarily. Okay. So next, I just want to quickly squiz over the sow thistles and the octongues, which produce these yellow dandelion-like flowers. However, they're really tall, weedy species that are, at least in my opinion, quite unmistakable. You wouldn't mistake them for a dandelion, I don't think. And so some of the characters of the sow thistles, again, they're tall plants with branched leafy stems that are glabrous to sparsely hairy. These pictures here are a smooth sow thistle. One other thing that you'll notice about sow thistles is sometimes you break a leaf of a hawk's beard, you'll get a bit of white latex. But in the sow thistles, if you break a stem or a leaf, this white latex, if you've ever done it, it will go everywhere. It's horrid stuff. And you'll hopefully see that here where I've broken the stem of this smooth sow thistle. Okay. Another character for the sow thistles is that the achenes, the seeds, are flattened and they are unstalked. They're directly attached to the pappus. Okay. And last but not least, we're going to talk now about the octongues, which again, these are tall, weedy plants with branched leafy stems. And with the octongues, they have abundant stiff bristles across the full extent of the plant, which is another really nice character for this species group. And again, the achenes for this species group, they are flattened and unstalked, directly attached to the pappus. Okay, so I've gone over some of the lovely morphological characters that will help you identify these species, and also dived into each individual species and the characters that these species and species groups possess. And so now I have a bit of homework for you. I want you all to identify at least 3 different dandelion lookalikes that you might have in your lawn, you might come across walking down High Street, whatever. I want you to identify at least 3 different dandelion lookalikes. And once you've done that, you could perhaps take a picture of the plant you found and upload it to Twitter with the hashtag wildflowerid. And if you're unsure, a botanist will come back to you and say whether your ID is right, or they'll tell you what you've got, basically. Okay, so that is the homework for today. Just to help you set this theory into your mind and solidify all this theory. So that is the homework. Okay, right. In terms of resources, I said I've put a key together. everybody. And so what I've done on britishbotanykeys.weebly.com, I have put together a key which will help you to navigate the different characters and species of hawkweed, bit, beard, and relatives as well. And so hopefully britishbotanykeys.weebly.com, if you want to jot that down, will assist you greatly in identifying these marvelous plants. But as well, if you don't want to use that, I always loved this photographic Collins guide when I was growing up, and I think it's a wonderful resource. The Collins Wildflower Guide is a bit more comprehensive and is great, and there are loads of other wildflower books and ID resources that you could use if you fancied. As well, if you upload your findings to Twitter under #WildflowerHour, that's another resource that you could use to help you differentiate between these marvellous weeds, bits, beards, and relatives, the dandelion lookalikes. Okay. Talked a lot about dandelion lookalikes, and I've also mentioned apomixis. And so what I wanted to mention now is this. Earlier this year, I did a training course on it was an introduction to dandelions, where I talked a lot about dandelions and apomixis, loads of other stuff. And it's a free training course that I uploaded to YouTube. And so if you want to find out more about dandelions and apomixis that I mentioned with the hawkweeds in the genus Asteraceae, then just simply type into YouTube an introduction to dandelions and have a watch if you like. It's for free, and yes, marvelous. Okay. What I lastly want to do is give a massive shout out to some fantastic people who've let me use a few of their pictures for this presentation, and also for the key on britishbotanykeys.weebly.com. So yes, thank you so much, Kevin Widowson, Moira O'Donnell, Mick Crawley, Phil Smith, and everyone else who's contributed pictures and let me use them. So thank you so much for that. Hopefully those pictures have really helped you guys in illustrating the characters that I'm talking about. So yes, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. Okay, and now we will move on to questions. So I've had a couple of questions. Let's just take a look. Just a couple of questions. Okay, so is there a difference between stalked achenes and stalked papaces? No, they're the same thing. So when I say stalked papaces and stalked achenes, it's just a stalk that connects the achene to the pappus and the pappus to the achene. It's the same thing. Okay, might there be confusion with hawkweed oxtongue? Okay, so yes, I briefly covered the sow thistles and the oxtongues. There is a plant called hawkweed oxtongue in Britain, but hopefully the key that I've set about on britishbotanykeys.weebly.com will help you to easily differentiate between hawkweed oxtongue and other species. The oxtongue, as I say, these are tall, weedy plants that are covered in these wonderful stiff bristles that have a different set of characters to the weeds, bits, beards, cat's ears, etc. Okay. Oh gosh, I think that's all the questions today. In which case, I will say thank you very much to everyone who's tagged along today. One thing I do want to mention that I didn't mention in the resources throughout the resources slides is BSBI. So the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. I I say it in every single course I do, and I will continue to. I don't work for them, but they are an amazing organisation. And so if you want to learn more about plants, become a member. It's about, I think, 30 plus, just over £30 to become a member, or if you're a student, I think it's £18. Don't quote me on that though. You get, as part of your membership, an enormous amount of stuff. You get publications, access to the BSBI's own journal, and most importantly, you get access to something called a group of people known as referees. These are people who are experts at particular plant groups, might be the Hawkweeds, bits and beards, and you get access to referees. If you send them an email or a message with a picture of your plant, they will help you to determine whether your identification is correct, or they'll help you to they'll point you in the right direction of what it is or what it might be. And so, yes, last thing I do want to mention is the BSBI, fantastic organisation. If you want to learn more about plants, definitely become a member. So yes, again, thank you so much for joining, and I'll hope to see everyone again next time. I'll be doing a course hopefully quite soon on an introduction to rush identification. Took me a long time to get into my grasses, rushes and sedges when I was growing up, these grass-like plants. And so hopefully years of trying to delve into them, I'm now fairly confident with the rushes. Definitely. I'll be hoping to do a course on those soon, and hoping to help you guys know what you're looking at when it comes to the rushes. So yes, join me next time, and I'll see everyone again soon. So see you later.